On January 28, 1986, 73 seconds after liftoff, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart over the Atlantic Ocean. 7 astronauts died. The entire country watched it happen on live television. It was the worst disaster in the history of American spaceflight, and within hours, the most powerful space agency in the world was in a state of institutional paralysis, desperate to understand what had gone wrong, and equally desperate to protect itself from the answer. What followed was one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of science. Not because of what was discovered in some laboratory, not because of a mathematical breakthrough, but because one man with a cup of ice water and a rubber ring sat down in front of cameras and did something that organizations like NASA are specifically, structurally, institutionally designed to prevent. He told the truth in the simplest way possible. And in doing so, he exposed not just the cause of a disaster, but the way that human institutions, when they become large and powerful and self-protective, develop an almost perfect ability to ignore what is directly in front of them. I want to tell you about that day, because what happened in that hearing room is one of the most important lessons in the relationship between science and power that I have ever witnessed. And it starts not with a space shuttle, but with something much more basic. It starts with the question of what it actually means to know something. The Rogers Commission was convened by President Reagan to investigate the Challenger disaster. It was a large, formal, impressive body. It had generals and former astronauts and senior engineers and administrators. It held hearings, it reviewed documents, it interviewed witnesses, and for weeks it proceeded in the way that official investigations proceed, with enormous institutional gravity and very little actual progress toward the uncomfortable truth that was sitting right there in the engineering records, visible to anyone willing to look. I was brought onto the commission, and I want to be honest about something. I was skeptical from the beginning about whether this kind of formal process was the right way to find out what actually happened. Official investigations have a tendency to produce official conclusions, which are not always the same thing as accurate conclusions. They involve a lot of people who have institutional interests in what the conclusion turns out to be. They involve people who know each other, who work in the same world, who will have to work with each other again after the investigation is over, and that creates pressure, subtle but real and constant pressure, to find explanations that are technical and specific and bounded, rather than explanations that implicate the entire system and the culture that produced the disaster. I did not want to be part of that. I wanted to find out what actually happened. And to do that, I did something very simple. I started talking to the engineers, not the administrators, not the senior managers, the actual engineers who had designed and built and tested the components of that shuttle, the people who knew how it worked. And what I found in those conversations was something that should have been impossible. The engineers knew. They had known for years, before that launch, before that morning, before those 7 people boarded that vehicle, that there was a problem with the O-rings. The O-rings were rubber seals, circular gaskets used to seal the joints between sections of the solid rocket boosters, to prevent hot gases from escaping through the joints during flight. They were critical components. If they failed, hot gases could escape, and if hot gases escaped in the wrong place, the results would be catastrophic. And the engineers knew that the O-rings had a problem with cold temperatures. Rubber becomes less flexible when it is cold. Less flexible rubber seals less effectively, and on cold mornings the O-rings had shown signs of failing to seal properly. This was documented. It was in the engineering reports. The engineers had raised concerns. The night before the Challenger launched, the temperature at the Kennedy Space Center dropped to below freezing. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that manufactured the solid rocket boosters, explicitly recommended against launching. They said the temperature was outside the safe operating range for the O-rings. They said they were not comfortable with a launch in those conditions. NASA overruled them. The launch proceeded. And 73 seconds later, a failure of an O-ring seal in the right solid rocket booster allowed hot gases to escape, which burned through the external fuel tank, which caused the structural failure that destroyed the vehicle. The engineers had been right. They had said, do not launch. They had been overruled by managers who had schedule pressures and public relations concerns and an institutional culture that had gradually come to treat risk assessment as something to be managed, rather than something to be honestly evaluated. The information existed, the warning existed, the knowledge existed, and none of it mattered because the institutional structure through which that knowledge had to travel to reach a launch decision had filtered it out, softened it, reframed it, buried it under layers of management and process until it arrived at the people making the decision in a form that no longer conveyed the urgency and seriousness with which it had originally been raised. This is what I learned from talking to those engineers. And when I understood it, I understood that the technical explanation for the Challenger disaster was an O-ring failure in cold temperatures. But the real explanation, the explanation that actually mattered for preventing the next disaster, was something about how organizations handle information they do not want to hear. Now, the commission was conducting formal hearings, witnesses were being questioned, documents were being reviewed, and the O-ring issue was being discussed, but it was being discussed in the abstract, in technical language, in the way that uncomfortable truths often get discussed in official settings, with enough complexity and qualifications surrounding them that they lose their impact, that the committee members can nod thoughtfully and move on to the next topic without fully confronting what they have just been told. I decided to do something different. I had been thinking about how to make the problem real, immediate, undeniable, how to cut through all the institutional language and technical abstraction and make the actual physical reality of the situation visible to everyone in that room, and the answer turned out to be very simple. I asked for a glass of ice water. During one of the breaks in the hearing, I obtained a sample of the O-ring material, the same type of rubber that had been used in the shuttle's solid rocket booster joints. And I obtained a small C-clamp, and when the cameras were on me, I took that piece of O-ring material, I compressed it with the C-clamp to simulate the compression it would experience in the joint, and I submerged it in the ice water and held it there. Then I let it go. I removed the clamp and showed the commission what happened. The rubber, which had been compressed to simulate the sealing configuration in the joint, did not spring back to its original shape immediately. It stayed deformed. It had temporarily lost its resilience because of the cold. And a rubber seal that cannot spring back to fill a gap is a rubber seal that is not sealing. That is a gap through which hot gases can escape. That is how the Challenger was destroyed. The demonstration took less than a minute. It required a cup of ice water, a piece of rubber, a clamp, and a willingness to do something simple and direct in a setting that had been organized around everything but simplicity and directness. I said something after the demonstration that I want you to think about carefully. I said that I believe the cause of this disaster was a serious flaw in the decision-making process at NASA, not the O-ring. The O-ring was the immediate physical cause. The deeper cause was a decision-making culture that had systematically disconnected the people making launch decisions from the technical reality that the engineers closest to the hardware were seeing and reporting. A culture where schedule pressures and institutional momentum had gradually come to outweigh engineering judgment. A culture where the information existed, the warnings existed, the concerns existed, and none of it reached the people who needed to hear it in a form they took seriously. At the end of my section of the commission report, I added a personal appendix. NASA management did not want it included. They argued that it was not appropriate for a commission report to include individual personal observations of this kind. I insisted. And in that appendix, I wrote what I had concluded from everything I had seen and heard during the investigation. I wrote that for a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. Nature cannot be fooled. This is the thing I want you to take from this story. Not the O-ring, not the ice water demonstration. Those are important details. But the principle underneath them is the thing that matters, and it is a principle that goes far beyond space shuttles. When you are dealing with physical reality, with the actual behavior of materials and forces and systems under real conditions, there is no amount of institutional authority that can change what that reality is. A rubber seal in cold temperatures loses its resilience, whether or not the managers above the engineers have decided that the launch schedule cannot slip. A material that is outside its certified operating range will behave outside its certified operating range, whether or not that inconveniences the people who have already sold tickets to watch the launch. The universe does not negotiate. It does not take institutional pressures into account. It does not grant extensions or make allowances for public relations considerations. And the job of science, the actual job, the hard part of the job, is to keep that reality in front of the people making decisions. Even when those people are powerful and the institution is large and the schedule is important and everyone in the room has a very good reason to believe that things will probably be fine. What made that ice water demonstration powerful was not the cleverness of it, it was the simplicity of it. The problem with the O-rings was not complicated, it was simple. Cold rubber does not seal as well as warm rubber. This was always simple. The complexity, the jargon, the layers of technical documentation, the management processes, all of that had been placed around a simple physical reality in a way that obscured it rather than illuminating it. My job in that moment was to remove the obscuration, to take a simple physical reality and present it simply in a way that could not be misunderstood, qualified, or dismissed. That is what science is supposed to do, not to mystify, not to impress with complexity, to find the simplest, most direct, most honest representation of what is actually true and put it in front of the people who need to see it, even when those people would prefer not to. 7 people died on the Challenger because an institution failed to keep physical reality in front of its decision makers. 7 people died because warnings were softened and concerns were managed, and schedule pressures were treated as more real than the temperature sensitivity of a rubber seal. And the lesson is not about NASA specifically. NASA has done extraordinary things. The lesson is about what happens to any institution, any organization, any decision-making structure when it develops the habit of treating the information it wants to hear as more real than the information it needs to hear. The ice water and the O-ring took less than a minute. The physical truth was always simple. Making it visible just required someone willing to do something simple in a room full of people who had surrounded themselves with complexity. That is sometimes all science is. Cutting through to what is actually there and refusing to let anyone pretend it isn't. If you want to keep seeing the world for what it actually is, not what it appears to be, subscribe. That is what this channel is for.